As you heard, today following our worship service, we have the annual meeting for our congregation. In some ways, it feels like a formality. There's important business to conduct, like approving a budget and electing new officers to our board and affirming Reverend Raina Hamry as an affiliate minister with Tapestry. It's significant stuff, but none of it is controversial or contentious. It feels a little bit like going through the motions. It's easy to forget that these meetings are a reflection of some of our deepest values. So I want to spend some time talking about democracy because it's not just a convenient way that organizations work in the United States. It's not just something we do, it's something we believe in. Believe in the religious sense of that word. We all know our religious tradition draws from many different sources, but officially, the first source of our tradition is direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. It's a little wordy, I know. It's not my proclamation. That language comes from our Unitarian Universalist Association. It's printed in the front pages of our hymnals and 1,000 other prominent places. If you listen closely, it's difficult to imagine supporting anything other than a democratic form of government when this is the backbone of our tradition. The first source of our Unitarian Universalist tradition is direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of life and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. Our first source is not the Bible or any religious text. Our first source isn't our history or the opinion of an expert or a person with authority. Those are sources, but we don't name them as the first. The first one is individual experience of the sacred. Every single person, regardless of class or education or any other category, has access to that kind of experience, that kind of wisdom. Last Sunday, for our worship service, our children and youth performed a play called Old Turtle and the Broken Truth. It was a lot of fun. With so much cuteness and chaos, sometimes we lose some of the messages in those plays that we put on. I got to play the part of Old Turtle. It was my role to explain why the humans were so confused, why they were hurting each other and the earth. And Old Turtle said, "Remember that there are truths all around us and within us. They twinkle in the night sky and bloom upon the earth. They fall upon us every day, silent as the snow and gentle as the rain. The people, clutching their one truth, forget that it's just one part of all the many truths of life. Democracy, government by the people, is built on this bit of wisdom. Whether you call on Old Turtle or the first source of our Unitarian Universalist tradition, everyone has access. No single expert or text decides. The diversity of our experiences and perspectives, the unique way that we encounter the sacred, is an invaluable resource for our collective effort to seek truth in love. It's not always easy to remember when someone else's experience or truth is different from our own. Our UU commitment to democracy and the ideals is deeply embedded. It goes way, way back, before democracy even took root in the United States. The church historian Reverend Alice Blair Wesley wrote, "Our Puritan ancestors left England for New England not because they disagreed with the Church of England over theology or anthropology, that is, over the nature of God or humankind. They left because they disagreed over the theology of organization, over the question of how churches ought to be organized in the spirit of love, over who should have authority and why." That was 400 years ago. In the early days of the colonies in the 1600s, little religious groups were popping up all over the place, and the government didn't know quite what to do with them. So in 1648, the government of Massachusetts called for some order among these wild churches. As a response, the congregations came up with the Cambridge Platform. And that document from 1648 is still the blueprint that we follow today to organize our congregations. It includes the right for each congregation to call its own minister, to control its own property and money, like the budget will approve in just a little bit, to elect leadership, and to create criteria for membership. Empowered with all these choices to make in governing themselves, these new American religious communities used covenants to agree on how they would treat each other. The covenants were written and signed by all the members of each congregation, and they reflected pretty basic promises on how they would treat one another. We usually describe ourselves as a tradition of diverse beliefs, and that's true. Some are pagans, some Christians, some Buddhists, some atheists, some Muslims, and more. But we're all Unitarian Universalists seeking truth and meaning together. It's not that the beliefs aren't the only thing that define us. We're different not just because of what we believe, but because of how we believe. Hundreds of years of democratic progress within our own tradition has culminated in this beautiful religious diversity. Our forebears began organizing religious communities in democratic ways long before American independence or democratic government was established. We didn't adopt democracy from the country we were in. Our way of doing church influenced this experiment of democracy in the new United States. It's part of our history, democracy and this country. They're both based in a set of ideals of seeking truth in community. Of course, ideals aren't absolutes. They're not things to be taken for granted. Ideals are things that we aspire to, things that we might achieve pieces of if we work really, really hard at it. Democracy, especially as we use the word, isn't so much about a particular form of government as it is an ideal. In its simplest form, it's about people making decisions together. But that type of equal participation in making community decisions gets complicated in the midst of 329 million people in the United States. As you know from civics class, we rely on a machinery of checks and balances, different branches of government, and a constitution and a judiciary that interprets the application of that document. We have a free press, freedom of assembly, public education, and other ways to keep people informed and engaged. When we talk about democracy as something we celebrate and hold dear, we're not talking about a simple form of government. We're talking about something quite a bit broader. In college, I was a political science major, and I stumbled into taking a class called Democracies and Democratization. We looked at what's the best way to describe and to rank different democracies around the world, and what are the things that lead countries toward democracy. What I got out of it was, well, that it's not as black and white as my grade school civics class taught me. There's a whole lot of gray. Beyond voting on occasion, there's not a lot of agreement on exactly what makes a democracy. What about distribution of wealth, or access to education, or peaceful turnover of government, freedom of speech, free markets, having the word democracy in your name, freedom of religion? We've come a long, long way. As this country was founded, by today's standards, we would hardly recognize it as a democracy. I think it's always important to remember that that Constitution that we uphold as the hallmark of liberty was enabled only when its writers compromised on slavery. It took 81 years until 1868 for Black Americans and their allies to pass the 14th Amendment, to recognize African Americans as citizens with a right to vote. And of course, we know that for about 100 years later, that right was still stifled in some regions of the country. And women, about half the population, weren't able to vote until 1920. That's almost within living memory. This history of our country isn't so different from the history of most others. It's a history of people trying to build stable institutions and honor the rights of individuals. It's a history of those people with power exerting that power over others until they resist, until they fight back, sometimes within the law and sometimes outside of the law, to claim what's rightfully theirs. The history of the United States is a history of people paying a tremendous price to defend democracy. And I don't mean defend it against communism or terrorism or immigrants or any other fear of the moment. Our history of democracy is a history of people resisting oppression, of saints and prophets standing up to the crush of wealth and power to say, no, you won't take away my dignity as a human being. You won't take away my voice. And this history is still unfolding. I realized this week that I hadn't planned on addressing LGBT liberation at all in the month of June. How quickly we forget the hard-won fight of marriage equality. How easy it is to forget that in most states a person can still be fired from their job for their sexual orientation. And because the issue isn't in front and center of us in this congregation, we forget that the armed services, once a guiding light for integration in the United States, now actively bans qualified and dedicated transgender people from serving. This history, our democracy, is still unfolding. It's an ideal that we are aspiring to. Just like our country, as a congregation, we're a complex, living community, striving to do our best. The work will never be done. As new people come into this community, they bring with them new experiences, new insights, new truths. They bring their truths to the conversation. There will always be new understandings. There will be conflicts to resolve and steps to take toward building equity and compassion. I know many of you participated in the survey that was conducted by the Committee on Shared Ministry maybe 2 months ago now. We had 122 people complete the survey. For the size of our congregation, that's pretty good participation. We just started to look at some of the data, and we'll share a summary of those results soon. But one of the main goals of that survey was to better understand how welcomed people feel at Tapestry. Now, I'm pretty thrilled to see that 97.5% of those that took the survey felt welcomed. And 94% felt that Tapestry is an inclusive congregation. Those numbers are pretty amazing. But we drop a little bit on the next measure. Only 85% feel comfortable expressing opinions that differ from the majority. That's not a terrible review. It does make me wonder, though, if we might cultivate a space for more diversity of ideas. I often talk about spiritual practice as something you do regularly to cultivate mental and emotional habits. Typically, spiritual practice is something that we do for ourselves, often in solitude. But I want to invite you today to think of democracy as a spiritual practice. Democracy is a practice, after all. You might view our annual meeting as practicing the routine of building trust, so that if contentious issues do come up sometime, we remember how to deal with them. We can use our annual meeting, our committee meetings, all as practice. Even our conversations at coffee hour, to practice building our capacity to learn from one another's diverse experiences. We need practice, all of us. We need the opportunity to practice here, to be restored here, to find courage and comfort here, if we're going to do the important work of defending democracy in our wider world. Amen.